Solved, the political discussion show for people with attention spans and those looking to develop one. My name is Jay, and our other resident solvers are Amanda, Deon, and Erin, who will offer a greeting now.
Hey there.
Hello.
How's it going?
Collectively, we produce the venerable, indispensable, not to mention award-winning podcast Best of the Left, where humans, that's us, curate progressive media on a chosen topic, creating episodes that are greater than the sum of their parts. On this show, we use those same curation skills to pull together stories and ideas that help us solve some of society's biggest problems, because if we don't tell you how to think, someone dumber on the internet will. Today, we're looking at how language impacts perspectives both on personal and society-wide levels, very often driving us in destructive directions, and showing how our language supports the systems that have helped bring us to the brink of fascism. Then we'll point the way forward. Today, we're starting with an oldie but a goodie and working our way up the ladder of severity when it comes to language. So first of all, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Everyone knows it, loves it. It means good old-fashioned American ingenuity and individualism and taking responsibility for yourself to create your own success. So we go back to an old article from the Huffington Post, why the phrase pull yourself up by your bootstraps is nonsense. And they say, quote, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps is actually physically impossible. In fact, the original meaning of the phrase was more along the lines of to try to do something completely absurd. And it goes on, people have been referring to bootstraps in this metaphorical way for so long, the original irony of the expression was lost. Nobody's thinking of the impossible image of pulling themselves over a fence. Maybe that says something about Americans and how they view themselves. That something that seems utterly ludicrous and impossible becomes a regular idiom for improving yourself. End quote. So ultimately, the point or our point is not the current use of the phrase is wrong, because language evolves, that's normal, that's fine. But it's good to understand how, when, and why language evolves as a sort of insight to our own society and how it works and maybe how we think of ourselves.
So they had some linguists and etymologists weigh in on this a little bit. And one of them talked about that very thing, that things change and it's really common and normal. And sometimes you get more than one meaning instead of a complete change and all of that. And I think that's totally fine and acceptable and obviously true. But I think with this phrase, because they were comparing it to much more mundane phrases of the past that have been changed. And I feel like this one is different because most phrases like this aren't literally used to shame huge swaths of people and other idioms. At least the examples they used, just these casual things that you would throw out that have no impact on someone else's existence. Whereas in this case, this is being weaponized and it's setting an entire culture's expectations that no one needs any help in this world as we literally make policies that make life and basic economic stability more and more difficult to achieve. And, primarily it has been weaponized by the ultra rich who have mostly cheated or taken advantage of or given money to change the system to work in their favor, to get their status and or have the path cleared for them. And so it's a weapon in the sense that it's being used to make people look down on anybody who isn't them or anybody who didn't get lucky enough, because truly that is what our society is about. It's about luck. If one person succeeds because they're in a similar situation to you when they started out, that does not mean you two are on equal footing necessarily. Luck happens all the time. And the fact that we don't really talk about that, and it's all about, did you do enough? Did you work hard enough? Did you fight enough to get what you wanted? And if not, that's all on you. And that's just not how this world works. So it's a little more dangerous than any other common phrases and idioms that we've been using before that have maybe changed their meaning through time.
I just thought it was exactly on that track. It was interesting that they tried to dismiss it when this one is fundamental to the American mythology. It is America. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps is as American a phrase there is. and it's bullshit. And it was always meant to show that it was bullshit. I think going back and seeing what the real meaning is and connecting it to American mythology and seeing that one of the biggest factors in your quote unquote success in this country is, did you choose the right parents? Were your parents rich when you were born? That's the real pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, is, were you born into wealth? And that's not something that rich people want to talk about or feel comfortable with. We've got right now the CBS Paramount merger and buyouts by the Ellison family. They keep talking about the son of Larry Ellison, David Ellison, as if he's some successful, like, genius billionaire investor. No, he was born into a billionaire family. That is his great success. He's done a great job buying things with the money that he inherited, or not even inherited, was given or loaned from a family that's got $1 billion just lying around. But that's fundamental to the myth of America, and understanding how it is exactly the opposite of what it means is also fundamental to understanding how America functions.
And I think I obviously feel very similarly. I thought the same thing reading it. I appreciate the fact that language can evolve, but in this instance, maybe measuring harm done is like a good metric.
Yeah.
And the harm this particular narrative has taken definitely impacts us, as Deon stated, like being the mythology that is so ingrained into our society. But I also did take a little satisfaction with hearing this origin story, because we all know that narrative is bullshit.
Yeah.
But it did feel like a little gratifying to know that the origin of the phrase was something ridiculous, impossible. It just, there was a little satisfaction in that, even though obviously I begrudge the effect and the narrative that has now taken root in that phrase.
I mean, to me, the biggest indicator that the whole Bootstraps mythology is total bullshit is that, as Amanda pointed out, mostly the well-off are the ones who talk about bootstraps the most. And they are also the ones who argue, they try to put it in real world terms like, no, we can't have a robust social safety net because that would actually be bad for poor people. We need to incentivize them to use their bootstraps, because otherwise, how will they learn? And also, it's critically important that there not be an inheritance tax, because my children need to be able to be given as much money as humanly possible. And those two things cannot go together in the same brain and make any sort of sense. So it's bullshit. It's obviously bullshit.
I really liked when they focused on the story. There's actually like a fictional character in German literature that they think maybe was the original origin of such a phrase. And he's a world traveler or something. And in one tale, he manages to launch himself up out of a swamp by pulling on his own hair. I was like, yes, exactly. Like, it's being used as a joke, as like the punchline of a silly story. It's just fascinating that it has gone through this evolution.
And wealthy people telling us to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, meanwhile they're already standing. Like, there's nowhere for them to be pulled up to. Like,
absolutely. So the next article is going to jump off from what Amanda was saying about how pulling yourself up by your bootstraps has been so deeply politicized. So this next article from NPR is about, well, the title says it, how cancel culture became politicized, just like political correctness. And it says, quote, the idea of being politically correct, having the most morally upstanding opinion on complicated subjects, and the least offensive language with which to articulate it, gained popularity in the 1990s before people on the outside weaponized it against the community it came from, just like the idea of canceling someone today. And continuing, it says, quote, politically correct was a kind of in joke among American leftists, something you called a fellow leftist when you thought the person was being self-righteous. The term was always used ironically, always calling attention to possible dogmatism. And this has been something that's been swimming around in our heads for years since we learned it, that it's almost exactly the opposite of what it is now claimed to be and what the accusation is coming from the right is that the left takes themselves way too seriously. They think that dogmatism is the only way forward. You have to be exactly right in your thinking. And that is political correctness, and that is terrible. And it turns out that the left felt almost the opposite of that, that they thought it appropriate to poke fun at each other for being too dogmatic, for acting or talking in a way that came off as too self-righteous. It was sort of a community policing's way too strong of a term, but like just a way for a community to create its bounds and not let people go too far afield where you're like, no, you've gone too far. You've taken it too seriously.
You lost the thread.
Like, yeah, you've lost the thread of what we're going for. Like, we have ideas and things that we're passionate about, but don't become crazy and over the top and completely off-putting. And so the right heard that and was like, great, we'll call them completely over the top, crazy, and off-putting and label them as politically correct, completely politicizing it and weaponizing it against the community that actually used it as a joke for themselves.
We can't have fun things.
It's interesting that it's not just a misunderstanding. It is a complete opposite take on the original meaning of these two things back to back here. Like, there is something deeper at play when it's not only just misunderstood, but used to mean the opposite thing that it was meant to mean in the first place. And with politically correct, it's not like a conspiracy that every Republican just got together and decided we're going to use this way. But there were a couple, like Newt Gingrich specifically comes to mind as someone who intentionally made all these things weapons. That was a goal. That was something that he did and doesn't get enough credit / blame for creating the modern Republican Party that just doesn't understand words anymore because they've chosen to just use them as weapons instead of conveying meaning. It's really scary that this person, Newt Gingrich specifically, had so much influence. I think Steve Bannon is kind of the current version of Newt Gingrich that just takes things that are innocuous or not even that big a deal and turns them into these culture war signifiers.
Just for fun, the article included a couple of examples. I'll share those. It says, and this is like speaking with a leftist who was active in the 90s, speaking about this, because this is all within very recent living memory. So they said, quote, they'd use the phrase politically correct to tease each other over whether their actions lined up with their ideals. Somebody would say, would it be politically correct if we had a hamburger? Someone who was a vegetarian would say that. Or someone who was a feminist might say, it might not be politically correct, but I think he's really hot, about some sexist movie star or something. That was the person describing for themselves, like, this is how we would joke amongst ourselves. It's like, it actually so perfectly exemplifies the natural tension in a political movement, people striving for a better world, but living in this one, wishing people were better, but acknowledging their own shortcomings. I mean, one of my favorite, I think it was probably an Onion headline that was like, feminist takes 30 minutes off to just enjoy TV show.
Yeah.
You know, it's great to sort of recognize that tension and be like, yeah, you know, like sometimes you have to relax and other times you have to fight. That is part of the nature of it. This phrase is actually like a great part of the history of a movement doing exactly that. Like, if you wanted to imagine a group of people striving for a better world, that's almost exactly what you would want them to do. You wouldn't want them to be dogmatic and over the top and super off-putting. You'd want them to be human and real and struggling with the realities that they're fighting against. And that's who they were. That is exactly who they were when they were using that phrase before it was weaponized against them.
Yeah. And I know we're not going to dive super deep into the cancel part of this, but I did think that some of the framing of what is happening with the word canceled in a similar way that has happened with the word politically correct is well articulated here. And one of the framings was the word cancel in particular. It actually just kind of means boycott, right? It means do not support this thing. Now, she says, conservatives have picked it up not just to mean boycott, but rather to say our value system is under threat by these people who want to demonetize or deplatform us because we have unpopular opinions. And so, whereas before it was like, yeah, don't support stuff by people or support people themselves who do shitty things and are doing antisocial behavior or harming people. Now it's about the value system and one being suppressed by the other. And that tool is really effective. This is why, for a long time, this has been the playbook, is steal words from the left and then redefine them. Like, these are just two examples. There are others. And just recently, I heard someone give a take, and I don't know if I am there yet, but their take was that they're starting to see that the left is creating its own language and not just co-opting the right, like the right had been co-opting the left, that we are creating some words and some cultural touch points of our own. And I think one of the examples they were using was no kings, but there were others. I can't remember them right now. And they were saying this is a good sign that the language fight that has been going on forever is indicative of who has the most power and who doesn't. And for a long time, the right was kind of winning because they could take our stuff and easily transform it to use it as a weapon against us. And that is maybe, with a big question mark on it, starting to tip into our favor. I mean, again, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about that, but I thought that was an interesting perspective.
On canceling specifically, if you think about it in the cancel your subscription, if you cancel your subscription to Netflix, Netflix continues on. You are not contributing to it anymore, but Netflix continues on. But if, say, David Zaslav, head of HBO Max, whatever it is now, wants to cancel a movie, that movie no longer exists. Like, that's the power imbalance in this. What does canceling actually mean? Who gets to actually cancel? And that's, like, we just saw it recently with the Jimmy Kimmel thing. I can say, I don't think I want to watch Jimmy Kimmel anymore, but the US government has the power to say, no one gets to watch Jimmy Kimmel anymore.
Right.
That's the difference. And the way that the right uses it implies that we are the ones who have the power to make these things go away, when that has never been the case. It's just been saying, you don't have to participate in it anymore.
Yeah, they definitely confuse systemic power with, again, individual power to make choices. I also feel like the confusion between a direct action taken to punish an individual versus just repercussions for your action, which is
Right.
mostly what any of the canceling has done. I think all of the big examples that were used during that time period, the person didn't actually get canceled. Like, I bet most of them we could Google. They've been booked for TV shows, movies, continue doing music, continue being streamed. I mean, again, I can think of a lot of people that we should not support, just like on ethical levels, that still have flourishing careers. So I think it was overblown and outsized. And we also know that the right doesn't do nuance very well.
No.
And there was so much nuance that needed to be added to the conversation.
And honestly, I mean, this is another co-opting that happened, is if someone was canceled, then suddenly they would have a GoFundMe that raised, $1 million, or they were doing interview circuits, or they got a job they shouldn't have ever had, like it started being a platform to then become famous for a minute and garner even more attention, which is deeply disturbing.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the origins of canceling, it's definitely worth reading the section from this article. It says, canceling is what comes out of Black discourse. It's what comes out of Black queer discourse. But the assignment of culture to that makes it a label that's big enough to be slapped on anyone and anything. And that is where the weaponization of what is otherwise accountability really takes off, end quote. So again, just like political correctness in leftist culture in the 90s, canceling was just a colloquial Black culture word that meant accountability, which is still what it means. It's obviously what it means. That's what everyone means when they declare on social media or otherwise, this person should be canceled because I don't like what they did, or we all shouldn't like what they did. And then you get into the power dynamics that were just discussed. It's like, yeah, we as individuals shouldn't support them. That's all the power most people have to declare a person canceled. Shifting that into a widespread culture that can be turned around and weaponized against the left broadly is exactly the same playbook. They did exactly the same thing by taking that language, flipping it on its head, making it mean the opposite of what it originally meant, and then claimed the entire left is over the top, ridiculous, repulsive, because they want to run people completely out of society when no one really said that or meant that, because we don't have that power. We couldn't even imagine having that power. But I suppose the difference is with social media, more power was given to individuals than they ever had before. You could have an influence collectively. And we went through this process of like an interesting reshuffle, but not really, right? I mean, Deon's point, if you're the head of HBO, you still have infinitely more power than if you're someone complaining on social media. So it felt like there was a reshuffle, and the right took advantage of the fear that there was that reshuffle, but it didn't get reshuffled nearly as much as they claimed. So wrapping up this article, speaking with an expert, it says, Clark thinks one reason that cancel culture has become such a hot national topic is people in powerful positions are unaccustomed to having to answer to marginalized people who, through social media, have greater access to them than ever. That's what it's all about, Clark says. If this had remained something that just stuck within Black communities, within Latinx communities, then this wouldn't really be a story. But because it has crossed over, she continues, now this becomes newsworthy, and it becomes something that is positioned as something that every everyday person should fear, end quote. And that was the trick. What it reminds me of is when Trump was being very rightly prosecuted for all of his many, many crimes, a phrase that would pop up on the right frequently is, if they can do this to Trump, they can do this to you, which is a completely backward and upside down imagining of how justice works. And it's like built kind of on that idea that is somewhat true, that powerful people don't get punished. And so they're actually buying into that, which is horrible in and of itself. They're like, wow, like Trump's powerful, and they're even going after him, which of course is how justice should work. But then they imagine to themselves, wow, if one of the most criminal public figures and politicians we've ever had can be prosecuted, then what's stopping them from going after you? And it's like, well, you probably haven't committed as many crimes as Trump had, but that's the sort of phrase that makes people think like they're going to go after everyone. They're going to come after me. And cancel culture did that for everyone, where they're like, oh my God, like anybody could be canceled at any moment and have their life ruined. And that was an amazing rhetorical trick to turn a relatively niche cultural instrument of accountability into something everyone should fear.
A final point on this, and definitely connecting to what you just said, Jay, the average person with some menial job is not usually the target, right? It's not usually the one on blast, but we're also in a new age of society where we have the ability to share our every waking thought with a huge audience at any given time, with no guardrails to make us think more deeply before we do that, right? If you want to say anything at all about anything at all, you can say it to a large number of people. And Twitter was public, and so that was different. Now, more of these social media platforms have more privacy controls, but there's still a fair amount of people that don't use those, right? And the whole environment has basically created we use the word context collapse in a couple of different scenarios, but in this sense, I mean it in the original sense that when you start saying one thing and you put it out there and your boss sees it and your mom sees it and your friends see it and people you haven't talked to in 10 years see it and someone you were an acquaintance with sees it, like you have not catered your message, right, to one of those groups of people. Everyone sees the same thing. And in real life, when we are interacting with our communities, we don't do that. We don't say one thing the same way to everyone in our life. We do not do that. And so the backlash to someone saying something awful online is interesting to me because it's like, well, I mean, it depends what you say, obviously, and how offensive you're being or whatnot. But We are starting to get this feeling as a society that I want to be able to say this one thing to everyone and have there not be any consequence, societal or otherwise. And honestly, that's sort of insane because in every other time in human history, we have not had the ability to do that. And so, because of these new platforms, and I'm saying new because the last 20 years is pretty new, we've like shifted our whole idea of what's acceptable, what should be pushed back against, what shouldn't be pushed back against. And so the question, I guess, is, do we get to a point where we all just agree, yep, people are going to put out whatever they feel. And so we really can't evaluate anything on any deeper level because that's just the new society we live in. You just have a megaphone and you go scream into it, and whoever hears it has to just take it. Like that's sort of what the right seems like they are saying. You can say anything at all, there should be no consequences. But there are definitely things that I personally would share with my friends that I wouldn't share with my boss, who I happen to be connected with on social media. And the fact that we have to adjust to this new environment is not a natural progression of human history and society. It is because we have been handed these powerful, powerful tools that have a lot of manipulative underpinnings. And now we have to figure it out. No wonder we're in conflict and crisis constantly.
From Seinfeld, George Costanza warned us about this when he was freaking about his worlds colliding. I don't know if anybody remembers that reference.
Yes,
but when different groups of people were coming together, he was like, worlds collide, worlds collide.
Right.
All of our worlds are colliding now.
Worlds collide, absolutely.
In the same vein of what Amanda and Jay both were talking about, I was thinking more why there's a subset of the population that's ripe for this kind of language, for this narrative. And I'm thinking about what Amanda said, where when you're posting your thoughts, also when you have access to misinformation, disinformation, it preys upon certain emotions like fear and shame, and it creates hatred. And so you have a small part of the population that has become very difficult to interact with and be around. So I think now more than ever, especially since a little prior to 2016, you're seeing the evolution of no contact with parents or other family members. You're seeing heavy boundaries. You're seeing people kind of take a step back and say, like, if that's how you feel, there's no reaching you. I'm going to have to disconnect from you. And so I think when the narrative takes off that like people are being canceled, there are individuals that are like, and that's what's happening to me. Like my family won't even talk to me, or
right. I'm being canceled by my community.
yeah. So I don't even know if it will be cancel or if there will be then another evolution of this language that gets utilized in the same way. But I do see like it is going to be really hard to combat that in the mind frame of others who are seeing in their personal life that like, yeah, when you're full of hatred and like you can't get past it and interact with people in a respectful, not even just respectful, just like a I don't want to say normal, but like it's not even the conservativeness in you, it's the cruelty, like the conspiracies, everything that compounds to make you a very difficult person to spend time with. So yeah, when they talk about cancellation, they can relate it back to their life and see the ways that they've been distanced from family and say like, yeah, it's happening. This is deeply in our culture.
Right.
But again, it's just accountability. It's just repercussions for the actions that you've taken.
Next up, as promised, we're continuing to escalate the severity of the language as the show goes on. So we've made our way to Manifest Destiny and Zionism, a legacy of ethnic cleansing. It is true that words like Manifest Destiny and Zionism do a lot of work in creating ideas and justifications for actions in people's minds. Interestingly, though, that's not what we're mostly focusing on. I'm not going too deep into those because we're actually leading to the role of euphemisms more broadly. But here's a quote from this article. It says, quote, "Ethnic cleansing is as American as apple pie and justified through the doctrine of manifest destiny, which emerged in the 19th century and promoted the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to expand westward. This expansion led to the forced displacement, extermination, and cultural erasure of countless Native American tribes. Continuing, it says, quote, President Trump echoed his 19th century expansionist rhetoric first at his inauguration when he declared a, quote, manifest destiny to Mars and the seizure of Greenland and Canada, and then later when he proposed taking Gaza and turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East, end quote. And then the article goes on to explain that the ideology of Zionism shares much with the idea of manifest destiny, which is used to excuse ethnic cleansing. But like I said, that's not where we're mostly diving in. And all of this is sort of just a prelude to this article sent to us by a listener, which is actually what kicked off the idea for this whole discussion today about ethnic cleansing itself, which turns out I did not know, although like as soon as you think about it for a half a second, it makes perfect sense. Ethnic cleansing, a total euphemism made up to justify genocide. Like, in what world would someone use the word ethnic cleansing not as a euphemism? Like, you would never try to describe something as horrific as genocide or crimes against humanity of any type and use the word cleansing as part of the phrase. Yeah. And yet that is the word that gets widely used in this day and age by people who do not mean to soften the meaning of the word at all. So it's gone through a really interesting evolution.
That's what I was thinking about it as progressives. When I hear ethnic cleansing, I have the same reaction when I hear genocide. There's no like difference to me, but it does make perfect sense that maybe to conservatives, or maybe this predates a little bit back, that they would hear it and it would soften genocide. But yeah, to me, the effects are the same.
Yeah. This reminds me of, and I don't want to say Democracy Now! Specifically, but I want you to think about like a Democracy Now! Type outlet having these conversations recently about, does what's going on in Palestine constitute genocide? Has it crossed over from ethnic cleansing into genocide? The way it's been used over and over again is like there's some sort of line that you cross and that you no longer are doing just ethnic cleansing and now you're doing genocide. And having this reframe, like the same with Jay, I didn't realize it was just made up. I thought there was some sort of legitimate use for it, even though it does sound really sanitized, because I mean, it's got a sanitizing word in it. Now, like going back, it's like, oh, the reason it's being used is because, especially, like I think it brings up in this article that genocide is a legal definition, and it does have, especially in the context of treaties, some sort of responsibility on the parts of the countries that do recognize that a genocide is happening, that you have to do something to stop it. Whereas if you say it's an ethnic cleansing, you can not only soften the atrocities, the horrific things that are happening, you also don't have to intervene. And it's doing so much work, and it is so normal that even, again, I don't want to say that Democracy Now! Specifically is doing it, but outlets like that use it all the time. And it doesn't paint the picture that genocide does, because genocide, especially in America 2025, if you think genocide, you think Holocaust, because that's what we've been conditioned to think. So if you hear genocide, you think the worst thing you could possibly imagine. If you hear ethnic cleansing, maybe some people moving around, like it's sad, but like it's not bodies piled on top of bodies. Meanwhile, that's exactly what's happening. And that's exactly what's always been happening. And that's why it's being used, because it makes you not think about, and the people that are doing it don't have to think about it that way either.
Yeah, so just to give people the context, this comes from a German outlet. So this is translated from German. It says, ethnic cleansing. Politicians, journalists, and even the United Nations use it. Where does the term come from? From the Serbian war criminal Slobodan Milosevic, who invented with only 2 words the most successful genocide propaganda of recent decades, end quote. And so the listener of ours who sent in this article to me, my initial response was, because they were very concerned about how ethnic cleansing is used and it's so obviously a euphemism. And I said almost verbatim what Erin started this conversation with. It's like, I don't hear a difference. Like, I've lived with the term for all the decades since the 90s when the Slobodan Milosevic genocide was happening. And it's just incredibly bad in my mind. It doesn't feel softened. And then I thought, really though? Like, as Deon just described, if you think genocide, you think Holocaust. If you think ethnic cleansing, you think something else. You think bad, you think horrible, but you don't think Holocaust. And so there is a difference, even if it's sort of marginal, there is a difference. And then also, just to back up what Deon was saying, the biggest, most important difference is that there are legal definitions of genocide and there are not legal definitions of ethnic cleansing. And so it is turning out to be an incredibly powerful weasel word that both describes and doesn't describe what is happening, both argues that intervention should happen, but doesn't demand it in the way that a label of genocide would. So it's really interesting that it's been accepted across the spectrum by those who want to say completely unapologetically that terrible things are happening. They are using, I think mostly unthinkingly, a term that inherently softens their argument and absolutely reduces the legal argument for sure.
Yeah. I do remember, it seems, although now, I don't know, I was a child. I feel like I remember Bill Clinton and other politicians of the day talking about ethnic cleansing happening in the Balkans. And if it was coined at that time and then immediately began being repeated, it's just fascinating to me. It's kind of scary in some ways because how quickly language can just transform like that. But why were we using their language at all? Like that, that's disturbing to me, and to be kind of fooled and manipulated. So that's why, as you said, Jay, we all have this very strong reaction to it, because from our end, as Americans listening to this story from here, we're envisioning terrible things, even if the word was used differently for us than it was over there. And yeah, it really is. It's concerning when you see how manipulatable language is and how we don't have any control over it, really. Which is good in many ways. Obviously, we don't want anyone controlling our words exactly, but we do have to understand what they mean. And we have to understand how they're being used, because they obviously have an impact.
I want to hit that point again, because this one, it was really eye-opening. Because if you go back to the pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you find out what it originally means, oh, it's over time that it happened, it's gradual, eventually it became this thing. Meanwhile, ethnic cleansing from the jump was disinformation, and from the jump just became part of the lexicon. And I'm old enough, I was probably a little older than you, probably. I don't know if I was an adult necessarily, but like when it started to be used, I was at least a teenager, and it just was in the news, and it just was a thing. And I just accepted it completely with no questioning whatsoever. And now, many years later, having this article show that this thing was made up to do exactly what it has done over time is scary. And now the tools that exist to spread disinformation are much more advanced and much more pervasive. And what else are we using that is wrong? What else will we use in the future that is wrong? We have to start being more deliberate with what we say, what we mean, and what are we saying? Is it even supposed to mean what we're saying? Like that kind of question, this taking time, taking a beat, you definitely don't need to post, but you also definitely need to evaluate your own use of language.
No, exactly. So, like, when I read both these articles together, I took it as a call in, because I delineated between genocide and ethnic cleansing, as all ethnic cleansings are a form of genocide. But I, again, in ignorance, took genocide to be like any targeted group. It wasn't necessarily linked to ethnicity, whereas obviously ethnic cleansing was specific to ethnicity. So I made that up. That is not the reality of the definitions of the word. It's completely separate, and it's my own understanding. And like, I'll say, I am the youngest on the call, that I hear a lot more ethnic cleansing. And again, I thought it was because all of these conflicts were specific to ethnicity, which is correct. But I didn't, do the step further where I'm like, oh, this is actually a form of again, disinformation that was deliberately spread to try to sanitize genocide, period.
Well, you made it make sense for yourself. And I think that's
Yeah.
what we do. I think I did the same thing, right? I was like, well, clearly this is a term that is being used in these big, international conflicts. And clearly everyone who's saying it knows what this means, right? And so you make it make sense. I mean, until we read this, I was thinking it made me just really look at the word separately and together. And I was like, ethnic cleansing. And then I thought to myself, how did we not see this? But you don't hear it that way. You don't, you don't have that response unless you examine it for some reason. And oh boy,
It was the 90s.
Quite a wake up. Yeah, it was the 90s.
Well, and that's why I added the caveat to mine that it might be my progressive brain that like hears both of them and has the same reaction. But Deon said that when you think of Holocaust, you think of a genocide. No, I absolutely think of it as an ethnic cleansing. Again, because I didn't like it's a genocide, yes, but it's an ethnic cleansing. So again, I was making it make sense for myself. Instead of delineating that, like, no, these have the same definition. How they're utilized definitely is a legal matter, is a sanitizing, not to be a little cheeky.
Honestly, the more we talk about this, the more I'm like, I would call the Holocaust, and I wouldn't call anything else the Holocaust. And I would call the Rwandan genocide the Rwandan genocide. And I don't know why, but that's just how it all fits in my brain.
Yeah.
So on all of these notes, the listener who brought this to our attention is also struggling with these sorts of things. And so they said a variety of things to me, and this is one of them. Quote, admittedly, alternatives such as forced displacement and genocide are somewhat imperfect, since the former doesn't include the ethnic component and the latter implies mass murder as opposed to mere, that's in quotes, mere expulsion. But I will personally try to stick to them. So yeah, I mean, this is the tricky thing about language is how do you use words that everyone knows what they mean, but say exactly what you mean? And I mean, my first draft of a recommendation was ethnic forced displacement, if that's what you want to describe. If you want the ethnic component to be there and you want to describe displacement and you want to make sure to emphasize that it's forced, you just end up having to make a whole phrase that says exactly what you mean and not lean so hard on existing phrases that are so inherently imperfect. I mean, sometimes they're imperfect because they just don't say exactly what you mean. And sometimes they're super imperfect because they're giant propagandistic euphemisms from the 90s.
Yeah.
This article being from Germany, it would have been nice if they had one of their super long German words that describes exactly what they're talking about.
Yes.
Because they have a million of them.
Yeah.
That would be so helpful.
I have so much faith when I can't find the word for something that I can go to the German language for it.
I know we have at least one person who listens who speaks German. Maybe they'll help us out with that.
That would be nice.
Any suggestions?
Yeah.
Well, at least two, because I know who you're talking about. And then there's this listener.
And that listener also.
Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to finish the conversation on language very close to where we began. We started by talking about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and how that phrase started as satire, but has essentially become propaganda in support of hyper-individualism and blaming yourself if things don't go right for you. Where we're finishing is on the satirical origins of the term meritocracy. So this article from Kottke.org says, in 1958, Michael Young published a book called The Rise of the Meritocracy as a satirical criticism of the concept of meritocracy. In 2001, Young wrote a piece for The Guardian about his disappointment that the satire had been stripped away from his term and embraced by an elite using it to justify their status. I feel like I've heard this song before. Continuing, this is what the author of the satirical book had to say about it. Quote, the business meritocracy is in vogue. If meritocrats believe, as more and more of them are encouraged to, that their advancement comes from their own merits, they can feel they deserve whatever they can get. they can be insufferably smug, much more so than the people who knew they had achieved advancement not on their own merit, but because they were, as somebody's son or daughter, the beneficiaries of nepotism. The newcomers can actually believe they have morality on their side, end quote. And boy, this is a sticky one. People love the idealized idea of meritocracy. Wouldn't it be great if people just rose and fell on their merits and nothing else in this colorblind society we all have, where no one is judged by what they look like or what gender they are or anything else, and it's all about merit? And so it's not at all a surprise or an accident that this is one of the many beats that the Trump administration is hitting over and over and over again as they attempt to dismantle the structures that themselves were an attempt to dismantle racism and sexism and bring us ever so a little bit closer, although always imperfectly closer, to the ideal of a meritocracy, but in a society in which racism and sexism and other isms are pervasive, you actually have to take action to counteract them. What they are doing is wiping away the counteraction and allowing the free market to flourish, for racism and sexism to flourish, and describe the inevitable results that we can see coming a mile away as actually just meritocracy doing what meritocracy does.
When I was reading this article, I thought that if this was like a grassroots kind of misunderstanding of the satire of the meritocracy book, that I could forgive that and maybe classify it under the Amanda principle, where like
Oh, we haven't talked about that in a
people
while.
on the left may read it and understand the satire for what it is. People on the right may have read it and thought, no, like this actually sounds like a good idea.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
the fact that it was deliberately used to counterbalance and justify the wealth that's being accumulated and the income inequality that we've been experiencing for however long. I mean, really, after the New Deal, it just started breaking down and getting worse and worse slowly and slowly, and now quickly. But I think this is going to be an instance where the Amanda principle doesn't quite fit because it
Yeah.
was deliberate. It wasn't just
Mhm.
a misreading.
Yep. Yep.
In this society now that we have, where it's an imaginary meritocracy, we also have an administration that is trying to demolish DEI and mischaracterize what DEI is, diversity, equity, inclusion, as an anti-meritocratic policy, while it's the opposite. It's trying to bring more people who have qualifications into a position where they could get into these different roles that they haven't been allowed in the past, trying to make things more of a meritocracy. Meanwhile, the right has decided that that is the opposite and has demonized it and has made a lot of people think that, if you, going back to the Charlie Kirk talk that we had earlier, if you see a black pilot, that somehow that person had to do less work to get into that position. And this society that is supposedly a meritocracy has always been anything but exactly the opposite. It's the kind of the same thing, to pull yourself by your bootstraps. The society is a meritocracy, is part of the American mythology, and is probably exactly the opposite. It's always been a society that pushes certain people down, 50% of the population right off the jump, women. That's always been the case. Many people, brown, black, different religions. It's always had obstacles to prevent meritocracy. And to still believe that this society is meritocratic, meanwhile it has all these systems in place to explicitly keep it from being that, to keep those ideas in your head, I guess is why you can think that Trump is a good person. Like, if you can believe that, you can also believe that Trump got to where he is because he's just smarter, better at business or whatever. Like, the idea that you could believe that, I think it coincides with all the myths that I think explicitly the right, but I guess some people on the left are capable of believing too, but mostly the right are capable of believing. When you think these thoughts, when you think these words mean something and they're exactly the opposite, it changes your worldview and it makes it difficult to make things that you think you want. It's really frustrating. It's so frustrating that we live in the society of myths and fictions. And I think most of us, especially here, would just like to live in a more real world. And actually, maybe, like, meritocracy is not real, but it seems like it's a decent goal. And to get there, there have to be some policies in place to fix things that have kept it from being that. And that's not what this current administration wants. They want the exact opposite. They want to go back to just the fake meritocracy as opposed to something that's closer to the real.
Well, and think of one of the prime examples that they use, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. To say that she is a beneficiary of DEI in a way that, like, her position wasn't earned or merited is the most ridiculous example of this, because she is one of the most qualified justices we've ever had. And there are definitely people actively sitting next to her that are beneficiaries of their white privilege. So, I mean, her being it gives away the game. If we had critical thinking in our country, if we had people who didn't want to justify the end by the means. So, like, obviously there is a white supremacist agenda that says white people are more deserving. And I don't care if we have to use the most obscene gesture. Like, we are going to take this very qualified person and make it seem like they are only sitting in that seat because of the color of their skin, and ignore the fact that there literally are people sitting on there because of the color of their skin. Like, it's really hard to not want to crawl out of your skin when those metrics exist.
I mean, we know exactly what this administration wants to do, and they're signaling it quite clearly. Just the other day, I was online and happened to be served a post from the US Department of Labor, and was rather stunned to see this clearly AI generated hyper 1950s Americana with a young white man with very, let's say, German qualities in the foreground, and a very quintessential, what looks like a New England town with white picket fences and a steeple in a church and fall leaves. And it says, "Restoring the American Dream!" exclamation point. And the text of the post said, "The American dream belongs to the American people." Is anyone confused? Is anyone confused by what that means? I don't think so.
On Erin's point of the contrast between people like Jackson on the Supreme Court and the people running our government, every once in a while I like to ironically defend the horrible people in our government for the things they say, because as this administration began, the first new word I learned was kakistocracy. Rule by the worst, the least qualified. So if you are a profoundly unqualified, not to mention cruel and stupid person in a position of power, of course you have to dismantle the meritocracy or any attempts to bring us to a genuine meritocracy, because you'd be the first out the fucking door. So no, we are not confused about what a white supremacist image of the American dream is. And we are not confused about why these people in charge are doing everything in their power to dismantle any form of diversity that could bring in qualified people who are not there just because they are rich and white and racist. Because there aren't an infinite number of positions of power in the government. And the absolute buffoons running the kakistocracy right now would be out the door so fast if there was a meritocracy in place, that of course they're going to do everything in their power to avoid that.
It's hard for me not to hear that and, like, assume you're kind of talking shit about Big Balls and saying that he's not earned his position.
He's not the best of the best.
Yeah.
Are you kidding?
I really feel insulted by that insinuation.
I don't know what to tell you. I don't think Elon Musk is sending his best.
That was my favorite defense of this administration I think I've ever heard. That's the only defense of this administration I think I'll accept.
And all of this brings us to Michael Sandel gave a talk about what he calls the tyranny of merit. And so we just pulled a few quotes from his talk. And so we gave the broad outlines of meritocracy, and here is how merit turns into tyranny. He says, quote, "Meritocratic hubris. This is the tendency of winners to inhale too deeply of their success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. It's the smug conviction of those who land on top that they deserve their fate, and by implication, that those on the bottom deserve theirs too. A perfect meritocracy banishes all sense of gift or grace or luck. It diminishes our capacity to see ourselves as sharing a common fate. And so it leaves little room for the solidarity that can arise when we reflect on the contingency of our talents and fortunes. This is what makes merit a kind of tyranny. It goes on. The notion that your fate is in your hands, that you can make it if you try, is a double-edged sword, inspiring in one way, but invidious in another. It congratulates the winners, but denigrates the losers, even in their own eyes. For those who can't find work or make ends meet, it's hard to escape the demoralizing thought that their failure is their own doing. It gives rise to a politics of humiliation. It combines resentment of the winners with nagging self-doubt. It's a potent ingredient in the volatile brew of anger and resentment that fuels populist protest. End quote. All of which sounds like quite familiar on both sides. I mean, we live in a world that contains within it a mirror world. We argue that we are living in a form of reality that we think we can prove is the more accurate version of reality. And there are millions of people living in a mirror world who see everything exactly upside down. They think you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps. They think that political correctness is exactly what they believe it to be and always has been. They think that the left are completely dogmatic, and they think the meritocracy is perfectly real. If only we would stop trying to help Black and brown people, then we would see that they would all sink to the bottom where they belong. This is the mirror world vision that they believe in. And the result of all of it is that pretty much everyone feels the way that talk just described. The politics of humiliation, the resentment of the winners continuing to win while the incredibly vast majority being pitted against each other. I mean, we know we're not winning. We know we're not rich. We know that wealth inequality is, I mean, speaking of language, we don't have a word that is strong enough to describe the wealth inequality that is being experienced right now. And of course, all of this is a potent ingredient in the volatile brew, quoting again, of anger and resentment that fuels populist protest. The right feels it, and they went with Trump. The left feels it, and they tried to support Bernie Sanders. What is clear is we need something dramatically different than what we were doing before. Trump's policies are absolute bullshit. It's a sham, but it was enough, lies and misdirection to trick some people in following him. But the problems that people are having, the politics of humiliation, the existence of a fake meritocracy that convinces people to believe that their failures are their own fault and that their relative poverty, which the vast majority of people are experiencing in an extremely stratified wealth environment, is real. That really is the world that every one of us is living in. How we interpret it is very much up to debate, unfortunately, but this is pretty core to what's going on in our politics.
I was just reminded of the word affluenza and how that was, if I remember correctly, it was used satirically as sort of a joke about how rich people lose their minds when they become too wealthy, or kids who grow up in these obscenely wealthy families and don't understand how the world works and get themselves into trouble and then get off the hook. And then a kid who got in trouble used that as a legal defense, I believe in Texas. That's the underpinning for me, is there's no excuse for everyone else, but there's always an excuse when the rich and the upper echelon and those at the top run into trouble. And, that's just one way they try to defend themselves, but there are many others. There's no accountability for anyone at the top.
Just to give a visual, Amanda just used a fake empathetic look. Which I didn't know existed until I just witnessed it.
I didn't know I did that.
We said earlier we need a better word for something. To the listeners, let's farm out. We need a better word for this wealth inequality that Jay said. It's unprecedented in human history. I think pharaohs, kings would be super jealous of Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, all these people. Like, whoa, and you get them to support you somehow? How do you do it?
Yeah.
So the talk concludes with this saying, quote, "To reinvigorate democratic politics, we need to find our way to a morally more robust public discourse, one that takes seriously the corrosive effect of meritocratic striving on the social bonds that constitute our common life. Disentangling the intolerant aspects of populist protest from its legitimate grievances is no easy matter, but it is important to try. Understanding these grievances and creating a politics that can respond to them is the most pressing political challenge of our time."
Yeah, we got our work cut out for us.
Yeah.
Indeed. So, what do we do with this entire conversation we've had, with all of these evolving phrases that all collectively push us toward bad outcomes? Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, we're expected to individually do the impossible. The idea of being canceled, accountability, in effect, becomes a dirty word, which allows the guilty to avoid it. That is the inherent effect of the pushback against cancel culture, as they call it. Manifest destiny in Zionism, it makes excuses for crimes against humanity, while ethnic cleansing and countless other euphemisms help to paper them over to be more palatable to the public. And even the seemingly worthy idea of meritocracy, achieving success based on effort and skill rather than nepotism, inherited wealth, or anything else, is, as we just heard, a double-edged sword that boosts the undeserving elite and convinces the poor that they deserve their fate. All of this brings us to our conclusion, and this article from Vox, How Societies Can Recover from the Brink of Crisis. And it says, quote, "My analysis of more than 100 past crises spanning the last 2 millennia shows that these outbreaks of societal instability are driven by a mechanism that operates with surprising regularity across different historical eras and places. The wealth pump. The term describes a set of conditions, economic and political, that transfer wealth from the broad base of the population to the elite, a small proportion of people who concentrate power in their hands." And the process works this way. It says, quote, "First, economic inequality rises. Then, political inequality follows as the wealthy convert their riches into influence. This development erodes democratic institutions, making it harder for the non-elite majority to defend their interests through formal politics. Eventually, systemic stability is threatened." So we're going to get more into it, but every single indicator, every single time points to the need for enormous systemic fixes to the problems we are seeing. Anyone suggesting changes around the edges, a little fix here, a little fix there, is not going to get the job done. And I think whether people can describe this in detail, they know it in their bones. They know that we need something dramatic. And to the degree that it is possible to understand the Trump voter, this is the thing that makes the most sense to me, is that people's desperation is at a depth that they are demanding some fundamental disruption. And even if they know the inherent dangers of allowing Trump to disrupt as much as it was easily predictable that he would, people were willing to take that risk. And we are not those people, but understanding that and understanding that it actually does line up with where we're coming from. We understand that we need dramatic change too. And that just needs to be embedded in every conversation about politics going forward until actual fundamental change is underway.
I want to add another word to this group of words that have lost meaning or are starting to mean the opposite thing. Democracy. In America, we call this a democracy. We're still calling it a democracy. We're on the verge of authoritarianism. We're on the verge of fascism. We're on the verge of democracy collapsing. Meanwhile, we have a Congress that does not represent the people, a Senate that has never represented people. We have the Electoral College that was explicitly put in to keep us from being represented. There are so many aspects of this so-called democracy that are not democratic, and we have accepted that they have gotten worse over time to the point now we are in, as we record this, week 150 of the government shutdown. I don't know where we're at right now. It's just a never-ending government shutdown. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has decided he doesn't have to swear in elected members of Congress. There's still one in Arizona, just hasn't been sworn in at this point. This democracy doesn't function as anything resembling a democracy. And as long as we continue to let that slide and let that be, and we continue to label it as a democracy, it will start to lose meaning too. So we need to start to demand somehow, some way, that this word means what it means. And that is not the systemic fix that Jay is talking about. That is something that we have to do ourselves and make happen. But collective action is the only way forward. And I think we need to think bigger. The No Kings protest that recently happened, I saw a lot of people talk about how the Constitution needs to be followed, and the Constitution is a perfect document. And I think, is it? Because I think we need to think bigger and think maybe we could write something better. Maybe we need to think deeper on our overhaul. The foundation of this so-called democracy is the Constitution, and it is clearly not up to the challenges of what's going on right now. So we need to think gigantic fixes and structural changes, because these problems that we see are based on this broken foundation.
So two things to your point. The first being that, and I think I've said this before, that the biggest thing I learned during the first Trump administration was that a lot of the things that I thought were enshrined in law were not enshrined in law. And they were all a gentleman's agreement and a nice little handshake. And I couldn't believe it. I was just stunned. And I think that, you could take Deon's maybe more extreme approach of starting over, or you could say, like, how about we actually make the things that we thought were holding everything together actually enshrined in law with teeth and consequences if you violate it? For instance, the emoluments clause, it's in the Constitution. Trump violates it every day and has his last term and this term. Nobody's doing anything about it. Maybe we could make things stronger, make things actually function at the very least, right? Secondly, I didn't think this would be relevant today, but Deon, what you were just saying about the word democracy reminded me that I had just read an article about how the EPA is going to roll back the fundamental underpinning rule that says that the federal government has any power to affect climate change or carbon release and anything like that, that gives them the legal ability to do this at the federal level. They're just going to get rid of all that. And surprisingly, the corporations who might quote unquote benefit from that are not on board. They actually don't want that to happen because that would bring everything down to the state level. And then there would be a patchwork of different rules. And they don't want that to be the case. They want something singular that they can follow, right? And so there's actually, there's the climate activists who are fighting against it. And then there's actually industries, including the car companies and coal plants, who are not excited about this, right? But this is the quote that ties into what you were saying that kind of shook me a little bit. So this is Bridget Hirsch, a spokeswoman for the EPA, said in a statement that rescinding the endangerment finding, which is what the rule is that they want to roll back, would unlock regulatory clarity like never before, and said the finding had led to heavy costs, particularly for the auto industry. Quote, "We live in a democracy, and as such, private companies are welcome to make decisions as they see fit," she said. I've never seen someone say it so plainly. Democracy is for the companies. And honestly, it's not even really the companies in this case, because the companies don't want this to happen. So we're even further making an example that this is an authoritarian regime. But saying that this is a democracy and then following it with companies should be able to make those decisions and do what they want is a pretty shocking turn. And, usually you see people on the right arguing, well, this is a republic, not a democracy. And they find some nuanced, ridiculous detail in there. And as Jay always says, a republic is a type of democracy. And this is a different turn. This is a different take. We should probably pay attention to that and follow that because that could be the next word to be taken over and transformed.
Well, and all of this is exactly in line with the functioning of the wealth pump. Giving the power to the corporations is fundamental to continuing to pump wealth out of the lower classes and into the upper classes. So, as I said, there are factors for how the wealth pump functions. So it says, quote, the wealth pump undermines the stability of society in three ways. One, it causes growing popular discontent. Obviously, not confusing. Number two, the wealth pump creates too many wealthy elites, more than there are high power positions. This is most clear when we consider that some top wealth holders are interested in translating their economic power into political office, end quote, which we sort of touched on earlier, that wealth grows to the point that people want to translate their wealth into power and influence. And that article goes on to point out that like there's still the same number of high level positions in politics, but the number of millionaires and billionaires has expanded drastically. So there's this perverse sense of inability for the super wealthy to translate their money effectively into power and influence. They're feeling repressed. They're like, but I got super wealthy. I should be able to like buy a seat in Congress, but there's too many wealthy people. Again, they're not arguing in this article that like those poor rich people are justified in being sad. They're just pointing out that is actually how they feel. And then number three, it says, the wealth pump creates too many youths pursuing not just college, but even more advanced degrees in hopes of escaping looming precarity. And so, again, in a world in which we recognize that all the money is being funneled upwards, there is like a mad dash of self-preservation to try to get into the upper echelons, which are not super welcoming. They don't actually want more people to have to spread the wealth amongst the upper echelons. And so there's a bit of a logjam situation. So it says, quote, this all creates an explosive mixture, raw energy and mass action, coupled with organization and charismatic leaders. We are thus left with a paradoxical coalition, alienated elites from above and angry masses from below. And it continues, quote, this dynamic, wealth concentration, elite overproduction, mass immiseration, does not lead to collapse overnight, but there is a point at which the contradictions can no longer be contained. Eventually, something gives, end quote. And I have a note on this. I happened to be speaking with a physicist recently about politics, as one does, very normal. And he was talking about politics from the perspective of physics. And he argued that political and social systems are bound by the same laws of physics that force equilibrium to be maintained. And he points out a system can be stretched. A rubber band has its equilibrium, but it can also be stretched. But it will always have a tendency to come back to the equilibrium. The question is, will it contract slowly or will it snap under pressure? One way or another, it will find equilibrium again. And if it snaps, it will be quite painful for society, just as it hurts to be snapped by the breaking of a rubber band.
I don't want to go to the dark place, so I'm just trying not to.
Same.
I was about to say, I feel like
Same.
yeah, that's as great.
We're
as it's
about to
getting.
get done. Like we can't.
Okay, so that idea put a lot of dark thoughts in everyone's head. And it's hard to know exactly where to go from here. So I have good news and bad news. We'll start with the bad news. The bad news is most commonly the rubber band snaps. That's not what the article says, but it says, quote, most commonly wealth pumps were turned off by a major epidemic, calamitous civil war, or transformative revolution. But as I said, there's good news. It continues. Well, it will get good. It says, but there are other ways to exit the crisis, and some trajectories manage to avoid a revolution or a civil war. And now it says, unfortunately, analysis of 150 past crises showed that they avoided substantial bloodshed only in about 10 to 15% of cases.
Cool.
I swear it's going to get good.
Cool.
But it is encouraging that successful crisis resolutions, rare in the distant past, become more frequent as we get closer to today. End quote.
Mm-hmm.
Yay. That's the good news. We live in the present where we have the best chance of not falling into a civil war.
Because we have hardcore diplomacy.
I mean,
and the UN, I guess. Ugh, that's a lot to put your hopes in, but I see the hope. I'll take it. I'll take the hope.
I don't necessarily think this podcast is about creating hope. I think we're trying to describe reality. And if you think it's dark, maybe because it's dark. And if we feel it's dark, maybe because it's dark. But I do think there is value in having your eyes wide open and seeing things the way they are, as opposed to trying to graft on some maybe mythical positive. The best case scenario is that there are some things that steer us off the trajectory that we're on, because we see it. The trajectory we're on isn't going to end in one of the happy places. But there are a lot more people becoming aware of what's happening. There are a lot more people that are talking about how we can avoid the worst case scenarios. So the more people become aware of reality and where we're at, the more likely we are to have a more positive outcome. So if that's the hope that we need, then I think that's what we can hang on to, is that a lot of people see things for the way they are. And everyone feels the way they are. They just interpret them in different ways that benefit the rich somehow. So the more people start to see things as unfair, and this wealth pump idea is fantastic, because the wealth pump is out of control. It is turned on to 100 and has been running 24/7 for a long time. We need to fix that. And when people start to address that in ways that cross over political divides and everyone can see, well, that's the real problem, maybe we'll end up on the no bloodshed track.
I mean, the one good thing I can say for social media is, yes, it does push bad ideas, but it also can push good ideas. And I have seen more mention of, can we point our fingers in the right direction, please, than ever before. I have seen people trying to explain, you and I are not each other's enemy. You who voted for Trump, me who voted for Kamala or someone else. Like, this is not the conflict. You need to look at our oligarchs and the overlords who have not only taken all the money, but who have been actively trying to make our lives more miserable, because the more depressed and deflated we are, the less likely we are to rise up and claim our own power. And we do have a lot of power. That's the other message I've been seeing more and more, is that it feels like we don't, because they want you to feel like you don't have power. We actually do. It's just a matter of if we want to stand in it and take it. And so, yeah, I'm on the same page, Deon. I don't want to be blind or to fool myself into thinking another future that is more rosy is on the horizon. But I also think you can take those negative visions of what the future may be and say to yourself, I don't want that. And so what do I have to do to make sure that we don't end up there? Who do I have to join in coalition with? Who do I have to work with to make sure that we do not end up there? And I think that's a pretty positive message at the end of the day.
Because of the nature of this job and the amount of hours of podcasts I've listened to, articles I've read, I cannot credit the person that said this, but I heard it or read it recently, that there is no such thing as fuck you money. There's only fuck you poverty. You can kind of see it the way that Peter Thiel and company are explicitly scared of losing their money, that everything they do is a matter of controlling and holding on to. And meanwhile, they're creating the situation where there's so many people who, even by fairly recent standards, would have been okay, but the financial situation has made even their life less livable. is creating a situation where there are people who in the past would not have been paying attention now have no choice but to pay attention, because you go to the grocery store and you spend $200 when you would spend $50. That's creating a situation where there's so many people who are like, well, fuck it, I don't care about this anymore. Let's do something different. And the more people can be steered in the right direction, like, why is it happening? And like you said, social media has done a decent job at getting a lot of people on that track. The more people there are that could be put in coalition to get together and say, we have to fix this problem.
I've seen a lot of commentary around the No Kings protest and people who are like, yay, look at these numbers. And then also people who are like, you're not doing anything. These protests are ineffective. There's not a list of demands that go with them. It's not a true protest. To me, when I see those, I think about a episode I did previously. It was quite a few back for Best of the Left, wherever you get your podcasts. So one of the things that was said is everybody has a different role to play. And I think in listening to the critiques and the arguments back and forth, it is not being able to distinguish what people's roles are and not to be able to see things for what they are. And I did take hope from the No Kings rally, not because I thought there was going to be a drastic change, but because there is momentum there and it's a on-ramp for people who may not be paying attention, may not actively participate. What I delineated through my listening reading was that people had a problem with the word protest being present, and if it was changed to a rally, they wouldn't have the objections that they did. And so I am all for calling No Kings a rally. That is fine.
Speaking of language,
to me,
boy.
that is fine. Like, if that is what needs to happen so that everybody has a clear understanding of what the role of this is. But what I'll say is the momentum, I don't think you should be upset that this No Kings rally is happening and that amount of people are coming out and actively participating. Now, what you can be frustrated is where that energy is being turned to. And I do think that it is upon our organizers and our politicians to take the momentum and put it somewhere, put it into action. And I would love to see more action being taken. But I also think you can't chastise things that are actually bringing people out and getting them involved, because that is what we need. We need a momentum.
It is a conveyor belt.
Yeah, and we're going into elections. So we need to show a rally, a coming together of people so that people don't feel alone. They don't feel isolated. They don't feel hopeless.
Yeah, protests are signals to other people. Fundamentally, that is what they are. They're, hey, you're not alone in thinking this is insane. There are others like you. That is the biggest reason for why we protest or rally.
And that weekend, I was out of town for a wedding, and I happened to step out in Columbus, Ohio. It was not their main No Kings, but I mean, it was hard not to take note. Literally, I was eating brunch, stepped outside, and the entire street was filled with people that you wouldn't necessarily associate with coming out to a protest, if you will. I also think that the imagery is important. It's important to show people mobilizing, but also having fun, because all of the kind of twisting of it is to show, oh, these are people are disruptive. They're very negative takes on it. And then you see a bunch of people in blow up costumes running up and down while others are cheering on them. And it's hard to distort that. That's clearly joy under this authoritarian takeover. There are clearly still people coming out resisting, but honestly just enjoying community. So No Kings is not the answer, but it does have a role to play.
Yeah, absolutely, Erin.
Yes, and collective action, as has been said, really is the only way forward. The positive example from this article, particularly pointing to history of the United States that we can wrap our minds around, it says, quote, "The U.S. was in crisis before the New Deal, but the New Deal instituted a broad array of redistributive policies, steeply progressive tax rates, strong labor rights, regulation of finance, large-scale investment in infrastructure and education, and the expansion of social safety nets. These reforms didn't happen overnight. They were the product of hard-fought political struggles beginning during the early decades of the 20th century, often driven by mass movements and reform-minded segments of the elites who recognized that continued extraction risked systemic collapse. Getting people together and demanding change is the only way any of this happens. So we are not in a position to make policy demands because we are trying to prevent fascism from taking over. However, having a vision for the future is also critical to driving energetic voters to the polls the next opportunity and all of the next opportunities they have. We need a new type of politics that makes someone put a politician's picture on their wall in their house, right? Like, we need the kind of politics that makes people say, this person is working for me and my family, and we're never going to forget it. And you end up with framed pictures of politicians, because when people are in desperate straits, they need for the politics to be responsive to it. Our politics hasn't been responsive to people in decades, and we're due. And so, as I mentioned before, people were willing to run the risk with Trump, but he was not the answer. He was not the answer that any of these people were looking for. So the opportunity is wide open to actually create massive change that people desperately want. Unfortunately, we are in the situation we're in where we have to avoid or prevent fascism from taking hold first.
Hear, hear.
So to wrap up, we'll end with this segment from this article. It says, quote, "Policies alone are not enough. The wealth pump is also sustained by narratives. The belief that extreme inequality is the price of progress." You might think about Bootstraps. That markets always know best. That poverty reflects moral failure rather than structural disadvantage. You might think about meritocracy. These cultural frames must be challenged and replaced with a new ethic of social solidarity and reciprocal obligation. No society can thrive when it abandons the idea of a common good, end quote. So, the question is then, are we going to bring that stretched rubber band of society back into a healthy equilibrium by the force of political organizing strong enough to reverse the wealth pump, or wait until that band inevitably snaps?
Stay tuned to find out.
Stay tuned to find out. At the very least, I think, did we draw a map to where we want to go?
We drew a map.
Did we solve it in that sense?
That's a good way to say it.
Okay, great. Well, if you have any thoughts on how to not let that rubber band snap, you can leave us a message at 202-999-3991. Email us to j@bestofleft.com or reach us on Signal at bestofleft.01. Thanks for listening, and remember that this is all really happening, so continue to be decent, act like what you do and say matters, and do it